Next up, we have our grown-up guest. We're very lucky to have the Poet Laureate of the U.S., also the program director for the creative writing department here, and my freshman year intro poetry professor, so we're really tight. Please welcome out Professor Tracy K. Smith. Thank you so much for coming, Professor. It is an honor to have you on the show. So obviously, you are the Poet Laureate of the U.S., which is a fairly cool title to have. Can you explain a little bit to the audience what that role actually entails? What's in the job description?
Sure. The job description is, it's pretty simple. There are, I guess, three things basically that you're asked to do. One is give an opening reading in the fall of the year.
Check.
Check, yeah. Another is to give a closing lecture in the spring on some aspect of poetry.
Cool.
And then in between that time, ideally, you're going to be raising the level of conversation about poems and poetry in the country,
Cool.
in whatever way that might be of interest to you.
So do you have a particular project related to that last step that you're going to be working on?
I have a project that will be kind of getting off the ground in the next few weeks. I'm hoping to visit some rural communities in the country, places where literary festivals and reading series don't always come, and bringing poetry and also kind of listening to what people have to say about the poems and poets that we talk about.
Cool. So far, has there been anything particularly unexpected or striking about the role that maybe is very different from you're coming out of teaching, obviously, very different from what you knew as a professor here?
Well, I guess one big difference is that here, what I'm doing is getting students who might not necessarily have written a lot, but who are hoping to write, to bring some of their feelings and questions into poems, language on the page. And what the job of Poet Laureate is focusing on isn't so much writing, but thinking, listening, and maybe getting over some of the apprehensions that people have about poetry. So I've been talking a lot more about the art form. One thing that I think is really interesting is that poems bring us into a place where we have access to feelings that don't usually fit easily into language. And I think when that happens, people feel really eager to open up. So sometimes at readings, I've had really moving conversations with people about what poems remind them of, what poems make them, finally feel like they're able to acknowledge. It's almost like therapeutic in a way, which is kind of lovely.
Does any particular reaction that you got from someone stand out to you, who came up to you after reading, or who's reached out to you about your poetry?
Well, I guess a few things. One, sometimes, this is what I think. I think that the vocabulary of poetry has so much to do with being receptive to mystery, being receptive to things that don't make linear sense, and having some kind of sense of belief. So I've met people at readings who have kind of felt almost like a religious sense, or maybe the poems activate some of their concerns as religious people. And it's interesting when we do and don't see eye to eye in that way, in that vocabulary.
So you're like God to them?
No, but there's a sense of, I guess, the miraculous that poems kind of wake up.
Sure. So I can't help but think about the way other positions, kind of different people step into the role and the previous title holder steps away. And I was thinking about how when President Trump took office, Obama left him a letter. Is there this kind of conversation between poet laureates in the same way at all? Are you getting advice from the last guy?
It's kind of under the radar. When I was asked, if I was willing to step into this role, I had to take a moment and really think about what that would mean. And so I reached out to Natasha Truckley, who was a friend and who was in this position a few years back, to say, okay, what did this feel like? What do you think that I should be aware of if I were going to say yes to this? And then the day before the news was announced, I got a phone call from Juan Felipe Herrera, who was the previous Poet Laureate. That's kind of like a passing of the torch. And he said, you know what, when I got this phone call, when it was announced, I woke up in the morning and my lawn was full of reporters. There were people. I was in my pajamas, and it was this really amazing thing. And so I went to bed that night. Okay, well, maybe something like that's going to happen. Nothing. So.
Well, they're missing out on a great stalking opportunity. Did you consider ever, when you got that phone call with the offer, that there would be something different about being this kind of artistic leadership position in the Trump era? Was that ever a thought?
Well, I think that what I wanted to think about was, what does this thing that I am really committed to, what can it offer during a time when there's a lot of anxiety, a lot of uncertainty? And I ultimately said yes, because I feel like the kind of focus upon nuanced possibility within language that poetry fosters is a really wonderful antidote to the ways that doesn't happen in the language of politics. I also really like the ways that poems make us beholden to somebody else's experience, whether that person is real or imagined. We're sitting and listening to a voice say, this is what happened, this is how I feel, this is who I am in the wake of some experience. And I think that makes us more curious about other people's lives in real time. And that seemed like a really useful act to talk about and encourage. So all of that made me really eager to say yes.
So in addition to all the roles that we announced at the beginning, you're also a mother. Your kids, your oldest daughter is...
She's 8.
8, and then you have twins.
I have twins who are 4.
Twins who are 4. What do you kids think of mommy being poet laureate?
The 4-year-olds don't really think that much about it. My daughter does, and she came to DC for the reading, and she met the Librarian of Congress. She's been talking about her all year to the librarian at her school. She says, I met the most important librarian in the world.
Suck it!
And then there's a moment at the reading where it's probably the most dramatic reading that I will ever give in my life, because you're in this amazing building, and then when your name is announced, these doors, which are called the God doors, just kind of open up, and that's right, and you step out. And so that was like a really exciting moment for me. But after the reading, my daughter said, I want to go through that God door, and so she got to do that. So that's her sense of what being a poet is about.
And has she started writing anything? Is she interested in writing poetry?
She writes some poems, yeah. When she was really little, her name is Naomi, and she had a pen name that she said, this is, I've written these poems. They're poems by Naomi Quick, which is not her last name. And they actually sounded like 60s era protest poems, which is kind of in keeping with her personality.
Starting young.
Yeah.
So something that people may not know about you is that, in addition to being a professor and a poet, that you have written the librettos to 2 operas. Can you tell us a little bit how you got involved in those projects?
Yeah. The first project came about because an alum of the music PhD program here reached out via Steve Mackey. And Steve said, one of my former students is going to reach out to you, say yes, he's brilliant. And I felt like, oh, okay, I've been instructed to say yes. I've never done this before, but okay, I'm gonna say yes. So I did. And the composer is Judd Greenstein, and together with a director and visual artist named Joshua Frankel, we created an opera that is thinking about Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs and their conflict over the vision of New York City, the car versus the pedestrian, and kind of like planned cities versus organic cities. And having done that, I thought, okay, I know what it feels like to work in a deeply collaborative form, and I'm never going to do that again because I wasn't the boss. I sit down and write a poem, and I get to kind of listen to my inner voice and make the choices. But for this project, I was, writing these arias and handing them off, and then waiting a few days, and then I'd get a phone call. Okay, we need to talk. We're going to set up a conference call, and then we like this, we don't like that, and I had to get used to that. That was like a big shift. I haven't been in a workshop for a long time. And then the next project came about because, I did that, and I said, okay, maybe now I know a little bit more about this form. And another composer, Greg Spears, reached out and said, I'm really interested in thinking about the legacy of lands that were purchased during Reconstruction by freed slaves. And many of these properties are still within the same family. Descendants and descendants and descendants have been kind of stewards of these communities. And now more and more commercial development is threatening that. And so we took some trips together, and I became really interested in these places and some of the art forms that are connected to them. And so we're working on a project that's it's a fictional story based on some of the real conditions that characterize these places.
Awesome. And that one is set to be produced, right?
2020 in Cincinnati.
Cool.
Yeah.
Let's go.
Well, I'll keep an eye out.
Sorry, I'm sitting here with my back.
Is the process for writing the operas any different from writing your poetry?
It's pretty different. I'm thinking in terms of narrative, which I don't always lean on when I'm writing a poem. And there are many characters that have to go somewhere and do something. In this newer project, it's really interesting because I'm not working from history, or at least a set history, and so I've invented characters. I still don't quite know what decisions they'll make, and that's really exciting, and it's also terrifying because I'm not a fiction writer, and plot is something that I've had to kind of inch my way toward.